Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond, my channel where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today we are finally digging into Goldfinger. I have wanted to make this video for a while and almost made it sooner, but I've had the opportunity to see Goldfinger the way it was meant to be seen, on the big screen, with an audience. And I wanted to use that experience to inform this take on Goldfinger. I've never seen Goldfinger on the big screen before. I've seen some of the Sean Connery films, but never Goldfinger. And it really was such a magical experience on the big screen. I'll lay my cards on the table right now. Goldfinger is not one of my favorite Sean Connery Bond films, at least not today. It was when I was younger, when I had my tonsils removed and was eating ice cream in bed. Goldfinger was the Bond film I asked my father to put on for me to entertain me as I suffered. I loved that film dearly. But today, I don't find it to be one of my favorite entries in the Bond canon, but I think minute from minute it is one of the most entertaining entries in the Bond film series. And it was a delight to see it with an audience. The audience was a buzz with excitement before the movie even started. I can't remember the last time I went out to see a movie and saw the audience so invested in what they were going to see, and they were with it every step of the way. You could have not asked for a better experience. I don't know why these films aren't getting a wider re-release. It seems like easy money. It seems like there would be such a groundswell of support for these movies if they got a theatrical re-release in a proper structured way across the United States. But alas, it's not to be. We just have isolated showings of the Bond films here and there across the US, and we got to take advantage of what we can. And so seeing Goldfinger in this way kind of enabled me to watch it with fresh eyes. I have seen Goldfinger so many times as I have all of these Bond movies that my perspectives, for whatever value you give them, are the perspectives of someone who has lived with these films a little too long. I know these movies inside and out. I've seen, I mean, most of them more times than I can count. And Goldfinger more than most. I know that film inside and out, but seeing it on the big screen was like a new experience for the first time. It felt different than the movie I remember, especially watching it in sequence with the first two Sean Connery movies. Seeing the leap from Dr. No and From Russia with Love to Goldfinger, it's a stronger shift than I had ever quite registered in my mind. The Sean Connery era covers a spectrum of tones and textures. But the leap from Russia with Love to Goldfinger is significant. We all broadly know that Goldfinger is the anchor point for the Bond film series, as it really launched the series into the place of a global phenomenon. And it's not a surprise that it did so by shifting into a mode of mass entertainment that the first two films really didn't. The first two films are pulpy thrillers with certainly cartoonish and exaggerated facets, but they are they treat their material with more intensity and seriousness than Goldfinger. Goldfinger, as directed by Guy Hamilton, who would go on to do many more entries in the series, introduces a level of self-awareness, of camp, that the previous films did not. There is a just sort of like knowing you're in on the joke silliness about Goldfinger that the previous films flirted with in their doses of comedy. But Goldfinger really goes all in on it. And that's to its benefit, because I think actually, narratively speaking, this is not one of the strongest Bond movies. I think there are some things that it does that are really fascinating, but I think in terms of narrative momentum. There are a lot of peculiar kind of lulls and side avenues in the Goldfinger story. And in fact, I think the novel itself, personal impression on the novels, and obviously I haven't done any videos on the novels, is one of the weakest Fleming novels. It's just kind of a little bit of a slog to get through. And the movie, to its credit, makes every moment fun. And it opens with such a burst of enthusiastic, like, play to the back seats excitement with that opening sequence. Bond is introduced with a bird on his head as he emerges from the water. It is a joke that sets the tone for how this entire movie is going to pitch itself, which is, this is silly stuff, folks. Don't think that it's anything else, but you're going to have a great time and start to buy into the fantasy a little bit as much as you're laughing at it. And when Connery emerges from the water there and establishes himself in this opening sequence, you are getting Connery at the height of his star power. Sean Connery has true film presence. Not all of the actors who have played James Bond, I would say, really are movie stars in the sense of, like, they just instantly own the film frame. Sean Connery does when he's really, projecting out into the universe his aura. And in this movie, he is having a ball, and he is also just pure charisma. I think, to the extent that Goldfinger is as entertaining as it is, has a lot to do with just Connery showing up and giving it all he's got, with more comic material than he'd been given directly. I think Connery is a gifted comedic performer. And I think when he gets really invested in the sort of more energetic feeling of Goldfinger relative to the relatively more subdued predecessors, that opening sequence is in what the scheme of the series would be, is a relatively subdued pre-title sequence. But it's a pre-title sequence that gives us some of the most iconic imagery of the series. Bond stripping off a wetsuit with a perfectly pressed dinner jacket underneath, and producing the flower. Again, this sort of very silly level of absurdist fantasy that the previous movies had not given us. This sort of outrageously knowing, preposterous feeling that then bleeds into this classic Bondian cocktail of sensuality and violence, which sensuality and violence are two of the facets that are somewhat intrinsic to pulp storytelling, because pulp storytelling is always about primal drives. It's always, pulp storytelling is always in some ways playing to the cheap seats. It's playing to the primal desires of the audience. Bond, as a pulp thriller series, has always played to sensuality and violence and combined those together. You can watch my video on the fantasy of James Bond, which is essentially that this is a character who derives energy from living on the edge, living at the brink of death, knowing that mortality is right in front of him. Each Bond has kind of expressed that in a slightly different way, but Connery's is just pure hedonism, right? Raw hedonism. In a way, Connery's Bond becomes more playfully hedonistic here. This is the movie that really leans into James Bond as the sort of daydream figure of the 1950s, domestic man who probably has a conventional job and a normal family life, and daydreams about being this super virile, hyper attractive man who can live life of glamour and seduce anyone he wants. This movie really starts to create the character that is almost like really a product of that time. But what actually accentuates the sort of like silliness of that fantasy is that the movie is very aware of how silly it is. Like this really sets the template for where the series will go in the Roger Moore era, and it's no shock here that Guy Hamilton, the director of Goldfinger, is the director that will also introduce the Roger Moore era, and its very comic, knowing tone. That this is not a film to be taken seriously as much as it is glamorous, as much as the escapist fantasy is there, as much as the you know as much as that fantasy is like in across the spectrum of these movies. I've talked about how the introductory films of the Roger Moore era accentuate Bond's misogyny in ways that I sometimes find uncomfortable. This film also really really leans into the essential misogyny of the character in a way that the movie seems to be somewhat aware of in terms of making a joke out of it. And the audience is kind of in on that joke to a point, but it's still working on that level as a fantasy for people of that time. And it's interesting that it kind of stakes out that boundary. It's very Connery's Bond is very much a figure of the 1960s. You could not do Connery's Bond today for a variety of reasons, but more particularly because he's not even Fleming's Bond by the time we get to Goldfinger. In Dr. No, you could argue that Connery's Bond is evoking the Bond of Fleming. In From Russia with Love, he's starting to become his more in creation. In Goldfinger, Fleming's Bond, with all of his sentimentality and emotional complexity, is kind of left behind for a pure fantasy figure. Fleming's Bond is a fantasy figure by all means, and Fleming was explicit about his intention to create sort of a vehicle for that sort of escapism. But Connery's Bond is just a pure cartoon figure by the time we hit Goldfinger. Just this sort of raw machine of charismatic presence. And Goldfinger does such an excellent job of just showcasing Connery's star presence from beginning to end. There's such good charm, even in the slow burn of Bond getting to know Goldfinger in two different sequences where he kind of outsmarts Goldfinger's cheating, first at cards, then at the golf game. It's this sense in which we're delighted to see this sort of smug, arrogant Connery pull the rug over this objectively kind of creepy and grotesque figure of Auric Goldfinger, who I am divided on whether he is one of the great villains of the canon or not, but the story uses the dynamic between Goldfinger and Bond very well. One of the best film scenes in this movie, and one of the most uniquely powerful Bond villain scenes in the series, is Bond being strapped to the laser with Goldfinger. And that's such a wonderful sequence because the two of them have such a complex power dynamic in that scene. And Bond is clearly grasping at straws there, but it is a scene in which you're seeing a real battle of minds in that moment. And that's not necessarily the case in a lot of the Bond villain relationships, but it's something that I value when the series has when it goes there. And you see that same sort of dynamic occur again in the absolutely wonderful scene on Goldfinger's farm when Goldfinger and Bond are sharing a drink together, and in real time Goldfinger is pleased as Bond is starting to put together what Goldfinger's real plan is, that Goldfinger is not intending to steal the gold out of Fort Knox, but blow it up entirely using a nuclear device. The sort of mutual respect and admiration they have for one another in that scene is unique in the Bond villain relationship. I don't know that Goldfinger is particularly a threatening character, but he is a memorable character. He is a character with a lot of presence on the screen, and he and Connery really get to have that sort of back and forth in a way that I don't think is quite true of the other Connery villains. Certainly, Connery has his dinner scene with Doctor No, but that doesn't ever really feel personal in the way that his relationship does with Goldfinger. There's just so much time that he and Goldfinger get to spend together in this movie. Um, and it's certainly not true of the villains in From Russia with Love, because none of them get as much time, though obviously there's a really strong dynamic with Red Grant. We do get to see interplay with Largo in the next movie, and we'll talk about Thunderball very shortly, but I don't know that Largo is ever fleshed out enough as a character in that film to start to equal the energy here, and I think the same is true for the Connery films that follow. So there's a sort of sense in which Goldfinger looms large just because there's just such of a connection between him and Connery's Bond. This movie is also very villain-centric in a way that I admire. As much as this is held up as the prototypical Bond adventure, the one that really skyrocketed Bond to, super spectacle power, and it's structurally pretty odd. The movie essentially becomes a heist movie in its final act, and it's a heist movie in which the villain is the main driving force. Bond is just along for the ride, and I actually really enjoy that structure. I think there's something to be said about how the audience really actually kind of wants to see what's inside Fort Knox. Fort Knox is such an alluring target. Like in any heist movie, the audience kind of gets sucked into this prospect of the unattainable thing being achieved. And in this case, we're actually kind of rooting for Goldfinger to get into Fort Knox, just so we can be there with him and see it. And the Ken Adams set does not disappoint. Fort Knox is one of the all-time great movie sets of its time. I mean, it is just... The real Fort Knox probably doesn't compare. It is absolutely what you would wish a vault of gold would be in the perfect sense. And it's such a grand set for that final battle between Bond and Oddjob. Again, a wonderful character who gets so much interaction with Bond throughout the course of the story. I think one of the reasons Goldfinger really clicks and subsequent films have forgotten about, that it's really about character dynamics. Even Bond's relationship with Pussy Galore, which is very much of its time, this sort of there are tricky ways to discuss that. I think Honor Blackman's character is very strong and forceful in a way that a lot of the Connery Bond girls aren't. In fact, she's one of the few Bond women that feel like they're a real force to be reckoned with. But you also have the fantasy of the time of a lesbian coded character being converted over to the side of Bond's allyship through coerced sex is a problematic element that sticks out in this movie pretty strongly as being very of its time. But what's interesting is about even that relationship feels very developed and thought through in the level of progression of interactions that Bond has with Pussy Galore. So you actually have this cluster of characters that Bond interacts with throughout the movie, and you see this escalation in all of those relationships, and they all kind of get their payoff in different ways, right? You get Goldfinger's final demise playing his golden harp. You get Oddjob's wonderful final fight scene with Bond, which is one of the best fight scenes in the series, and you get obviously Bond and Pussy Galore ending up together kind of in the very standard version of the Bond ending, with them recover, waiting to be rescued, but Bond delaying his rescue a little bit longer just to be in the tender embrace of Pussy Galore a little bit longer. I think part of what the structure of that movie works so well as entertainment is ultimately because it is really character focused. And I think that's something that Bond films missed about Goldfinger. I think, the films that kind of like try to harken back to Goldfinger honestly miss that it really works because it's a film where the characters are the glue of the story. In fact, the story kind of like stops wholesale for big sections of the movie. We get a big golf sequence. The sequence at the farm is just a lot of like little episodes of Goldfinger doing his briefing, Bond being captured in a cell, jokes there. It's all really entertaining and it actually all works, I think. But it's interesting that it's not narrative momentum that's driving Goldfinger. It's a lot of these interplays between the characters and the dynamics and the shifting power dynamics. What's interesting about the Kentucky farm sequence with Goldfinger is that it's really this interplay between this core trio of Pussy Galore, Goldfinger, and Bond, and the various dynamics you see between them. There's a really interesting scene between Goldfinger and Pussy Galore where you feel the unique nature of their relationship and the weird power balances there that Bond will later exploit. Structurally, that's a lot more sound and intelligent than a lot of the more like overtly fantastical Bond movies will be, at least on a narrative level. I think if anything kind of holds back Goldfinger from like the top spot of like being the ultimate Bond spectacles, I think that there in terms of like visual splendor, I think it's not the most attractive film of the Connery era. From Russia with Love is a lovelier film in a lot of respects, and I think some of the following movies offer more visual spectacle. The whole raid on Fort Knox, in general, feels a little bit like perfunctory on a visual level, and not just because it's Kentucky. It's just kind of how it's filmed. It feels like it's shot with a lot of coverage and kind of like edited together. But the moments that need to hit do, and I think this movie benefited from the fact that it had the best marketing image of any Bond movie, and that is the image emblazoned in its title sequence, probably the best of the Bond title sequences, objectively speaking, regardless of whether it's my favorite, and it's not my favorite Bond song, it's not my personal favorite title sequence, but in terms of raw iconography, nothing beats Robert Brown-John's title sequence for this movie, because he's dealing with an image that captures everything the Bond series is about at like a kind of like underpinning level, which is glamour, sensuality, and violence. And the image of a dead girl covered in gold paint is so mysterious, so kind of uncanny and creepy in a little way, but not so creepy that it undercuts the sort of glamour fantasy of it. It's pretty much one of the ultimate pulp images in cinema, and it's no surprise that it was emblazoned over the entire ad campaign, and that no doubt contributed to Goldfinger's great success. I mean, that is a marketing like image you can bank on. And it's interesting that like when the series tries to revisit it, like say in Quantum of Solace, where you have fields covered in oil recreating that exact same moment, it doesn't work as well because it loses the glamour of it. There's a particular balance in that image of Masterson's death, and the way that that's even presented in the movie with John Barry's score, the chiming bit, almost signaling like the metallicness of this character's death. It's a creepy moment. It actually, the idea of it terrified me as a kid. It was one of the reasons Goldfinger was like locked into my brain from a very young age, was this idea of a person dying because they were covered in gold paint is a really macabre image. And there's a sense in which the Bond movies flirt with these horror film textures over and over again. There's a version of this image that occurs in a horror movie, but Bond applies the levels of glamour, this sensationalism to it, and pulls it into this broader fantasy of death and sensuality, and luxury and hedonism. And that image really just kind of sums it all up. You can't come up with a better single image from the series to capture everything that this has driven this series to success. And so in that way, Goldfinger is in some ways indispensable to the series. I think as someone who has spent too long with these movies, I have my more idiosyncratic favorites that I cherish more than Goldfinger, I think. Especially on this rewatch, I think I find myself leaning much more towards the territory of From Russia with Love, with its greater dose of intrigue and, kind of thorny storytelling and rich portrait of a foreign locale. Whereas Goldfinger is just a lot of really big fun, but it doesn't quite hit the same frequency for me, subjectively speaking. But I think it's very hard to argue that this is not like the Bond movie that really captures what the series is about, as opposed to the character. The character of James Bond, I always go back to Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming created the character of James Bond. Fleming's Bond also always has precedent in my mind. But the Bond we get, particularly in Goldfinger, is the cinematic Bond. This sort of semi-absurdist character that is a character of exaggerated hedonism, taken right up to the point of an outrageous joke, but not quite fully jumping over into it as it does in the Roger Moore era entries, some of them. It stays right on that cusp there so that it can operate as both a joke and a fantasy for its audience members to buy into. It's a really interesting picture of its time, and it's no wonder that it's become such a reference point for this 1960s. It's really a time capsule of a particular age, a particular approach to masculinity, a particular approach to cinema, to music. The iconic theme song of Goldfinger, which, you can listen to my video on the Bond songs if you want to hear more about that, is one of the most iconic songs in film history. And it's such a silly song, but again, it's doing what this entire movie does in a nutshell, which is being so outrageously silly, but not leaping all the way into just empty farce. It is, there's still like a there, if I don't know, if to not put it, to put it in like a very vague terms, like there's something really interesting about the song Goldfinger. It's a strange song. It's not just a silly song. The 60s were full of really preposterous and goofy songs, and there's plenty of like quasi-Bond parody songs that don't hit the same mark. There's something about Goldfinger as a song that gets under the skin. The particular chords, the conviction with which Dame Shirley belts out those notes, and there's a sense that this whole movie works in that same way. It's a big cinematic joke that still has some force behind it, still has some teeth, and that's why it continues to stand the test of time. There's not really quite another movie like Goldfinger, and you gotta give it its laurels for that, even though pieces of it haven't aged as well, or things about it we might quibble about as, being better in other Bond movies. It's a pretty unique cinematic event, and it's its 60th anniversary this year, so credit where credit's due. Goldfinger's gone the distance. So let me know what you think about Goldfinger. I'm sure you all have strong opinions, as you always do, and I look forward to hearing from you all about them. And I will catch you in the next one, which may or may not be when I tackle Thunderball.